Okay, so we're going to talk about the lymphatic system. Let me get my slide going. This system is our next system. We're now well into the fourth exam unit. So the lymphatic system is our major system that fights infection. So we're going to talk about the cells of the lymphatic system, which are extremely important. Some of these cells we've already talked about, like lymphocytes, T cells, B cells. We've identified lymphocytes as a cell that's about the same size as a red blood cell when we talked about blood. And has a big nucleus that takes up most of the cell. There's actually two types of lymphocytes. So these are the major cells of the lymphatic system, lymphocytes, but they use other cells for help, basically, in fighting infection. There's also lymphatic vessels. So just like blood vessels in the cardiovascular system, we have lymphatic vessels that are very similar to veins. Like we've got in the cardiovascular system, arteries and veins. Lymphatic vessels are very similar to veins, but they're a one-way route. So we'll talk about that. And then there's lymphoid tissues and organs that are basically scattered throughout the body, but they're located in areas of the body that are most important to fight infection. So lymphocytes are again, major cells we've identified of the lymphatic system. We've identified these cells when we talked about blood in the last unit. These lymphocytes basically defend against any invading pathogen like viruses or bacteria or parasites, or any abnormal body cells like cancerous cells or that have been mutated, or foreign proteins that are called antigens. So we're going to talk about what an antigen is, because lymphocytes can recognize these things called antigens as non-self or not supposed to be there in your body, and then fight those antigens to prevent infection or further infection. Most are produced and stored within lymphoid tissues and organs, but they're also produced in red bone marrow. And they're surrounded by lymph, which is a fluid. It's a type of fluid connective tissue. So when we talked about connective tissues, there's two types of fluid connective tissues. Blood is a fluid connective tissue, and lymph is a lot like blood minus the blood cells. So there's no red blood cells in lymph. So it's a lot like plasma, the fluid component of blood. There's a kind of an overview of lymphatic vessels and lymph nodes. Lymph nodes are swollen sections of lymphatic vessels. Like if you've ever been sick and had a cold and you feel like in your neck when you have a head cold, you feel these bumps along your neck. Those are lymph nodes that are swollen. They get tender because there's cells there that kind of get stuck, and there's your body's fighting infection, and as it fights infection, the lymphatic fluid that's making its way through the lymphatic vessels gets filtered, and all the nasty stuff gets filtered out of the lymph fluid and gets stuck in those lymph nodes, so they can get swollen and tender. But that's what those bumps that you feel in your neck. So this is look at all the green vessels here. These are all lymphatic vessels. The little tiny bumps there, those little nodes are lymph nodes. You've got tonsils. If you ever had your tonsils out, you know exactly what tonsils are. The thymus, the spleen. In your digestive system, we have a lot of what's called mucosal-associated lymphoid tissue in the digestive, respiratory, urinary, reproductive tracts. So any tract where you're one long tube, you typically have quite a bit of lymphoid tissue to fight any infection that may be coming in from the external environment. Lymphatic vessels carry lymph fluid. So I'm just going to call it lymph from now on, but it is a fluid. So this lymph is a fluid. So they carry lymph from peripheral tissues where it's produced. So basically lymph is a lot like plasma or interstitial fluid. And interstitial fluid is in the fluid in the tissues. That fluid is fluid that's leaving the blood without red blood cells, right? Fluid leaves the blood and heads into the interstitial, basically diffuses into the interstitial spaces in the tissue. And then it gets drained out of the interstitial spaces into lymphatic vessels. Those lymphatic vessels then carry lymph all the way back to the venous side of circulation. So in the circulatory system, lymph fluid makes its way back. So it basically comes out of circulation from blood vessels, is carried all the way back by way of lymphatic vessels into circulation. So it just kind of gets removed and then sent back into circulation. So it's a one-way route. And it begins with lymphatic capillaries. So the interstitial fluid flows into those capillaries, and the capillaries are a lot like capillaries that you would expect to see in the cardiovascular system. And that fluid, again, is called lymph. So here's a arterial capillary bed, arterial side, and then venous side, and a venule. Remember, venules merge back into veins, larger and larger veins, and they eventually send deoxygenated blood back to the heart. Well, these lymphatic capillaries merge back to bigger and larger vessels, and they basically dump or drain lymph fluid right back into the veins. And we'll talk about what veins they drain into. So lymph flows from lymphatic capillaries to larger lymphatic vessels towards the thoracic cavity. So all lymph fluid, regardless of whether it is collected by lymphatic capillaries in your fingers and toes, or in your head, or in your abdominal region, that lymph fluid makes its way back to the thoracic cavity, where there's larger lymphatic vessels that contain valves. And valves basically, in any valve in the body, it prevents the backflow of fluid, like valves in the heart prevent the backflow of blood. Valves in veins prevent the backflow of blood. Basically, there's a pretty low pressure in lymphatic vessels, so the valves prevent the backflow of lymphatic fluid and push and help move lymphatic fluid towards the thoracic cavity, where it empties back into some major veins. It's actually the subclavian veins, so we'll talk about. So this is a valve right here, this kind of V, sideways V, that's a valve in a lymphatic vessel. There's just a kind of an overview slide here of the flow of lymphatic fluid. So fluid, basically similar to plasma, leaves the capillary beds and heads into the interstitial space. That interstitial fluid drains into lymphatic capillaries. Lymphatic capillaries transport that lymph into larger and larger lymph vessels and then send it back into circulation. So you've got that lymph fluid becoming a component of venous blood, going back to the right side of the heart, getting pumped out to the lungs, heading back to the left side of the heart, and then getting pumped out to the body, and that circuit starts all over again. So lymph fluid leaves the capillaries, is drained into the interstitial spaces, is drained by lymphatic capillaries and sent right back in. So lymphatic vessels only have a one-way route of fluid movement. There are a set of superficial let me get my slide back up here. Superficial and deep lymphatics that all converge into larger vessels called trunks, and those trunks empty into a thoracic duct and a right lymphatic duct. So these are the major lymph ducts. Okay. So lymphatic drainage, again, is superficial to deep lymphatics converge basically to form what's called trunks in the lymphatic system. And these trunks send lymphatic fluid to collecting vessels, two major. One's called the thoracic duct, and there's a structure I will point out here called the cisterna chyli, which is an expanded chamber at the base, where basically with the very beginning of the thoracic duct, and then the right lymphatic duct. So look at this. Drainage into the thoracic duct, which is located right around in here. Well, I'll show you exactly where shortly. Basically all lymphatic fluid from the entire lower body all the way up into the abdominal cavity. Basically, anywhere below the diaphragm is drained in the thoracic duct, but also the left extremity, left side of the head, and left thoracic cavity. So this entire area that's darker green is drained into just the thoracic duct, has a huge job. Remember that lymph fluid is sent from lymphatic vessels all the way back to the thoracic duct and sent into venous circulation. We'll talk about what veins specifically. And then the right lymphatic duct just drains the right thoracic cavity, the right side of the head, and right extremity. So it collects lymph from the body inferior to the diaphragm, both left and right side. The left side of the superior, that's basically superior to the diaphragm as well. And it empties into the left subclavian vein. So remember, the subclavian vein, sub is under, clavian would be clavicle. So the left subclavian vein is the vein that is heading back to the right side of the heart on the left side, just under the clavicle. And then the right lymphatic duct collects lymph fluid from the right side of the body superior to the diaphragm. And remember, the diaphragm is the muscle of breathing, so it's just kind of separates the thoracic and abdominal cavities. And that empties into the right subclavian vein. So take a look. Right here is the thoracic duct, but it starts down here. This is the cisterna chyli, that big swollen pouch at the beginning of the thoracic duct, and then it runs all the way up through the thoracic cavity. Look at all these lymph vessels draining into the thoracic duct. And this basically takes a little turn and then heads right into the subclavian vein, which is right here. This is the subclavian vein. And then the subclavian veins merge into the brachiocephalic veins. And those brachiocephalic veins on the right and left side empty into the superior vena cava. So we've got right subclavian vein, and right there is the right lymphatic duct. So those locations are really important, because that's where all lymph fluid is draining back into the veins, the venous circulation. If some blockage occurs, it's called lymphedema. So edema is a swelling or a building up of fluid. And that's caused by a blockage in lymphatic drainage. So what happens is, if you're blocking lymph fluid from making its way back to the veins, the venous circulation, it can get stuck in the tissue. If it gets stuck in the tissue, it causes swelling and distension, basically. And it usually affects the limbs, like arms and legs, but it can affect other areas. And that swelling can become permanent. It can cause major tissue damage. It can cause the loss of a limb, because basically that fluid buildup puts pressure on blood vessels and can cut off blood flow. You can literally lose a limb because of this. So it can be really serious. A lot of times in cancer patients that have had lymph nodes removed to prevent the spread of cancer, they've got a problem with lymphedema and have to have it treated on a regular basis. So this can be a really serious condition. Lymphocytes account for about 30% of circulating leukocytes. Remember, leukocytes is a broad term for white blood cells. So lymphocytes are one of 5 types of white blood cells, and there's 3 classes of them: T cells, B cells, and natural killer cells. That's what NK cells are, natural killer cells. So all classes of lymphocytes are basically sensitive to what's called an antigen. And an antigen is a protein that's embedded in a cell membrane that basically marks, it's a beacon on that cell that marks that cell as self, meaning it's supposed to be in the body, or non-self. So antigens are what are recognized by lymphocytes as self. Yes, you're allowed to stay and you can be there. So some of your own body cells, a lot of your own body cells have antigens, like your red blood cells have antigens. That's what creates your blood type. When we talked about blood typing, we talked about antigens. So like the A antigen, the B antigen, the Rh or D antigen, that's basically an antigen on red blood cells. And your lymph system or lymphatic system and these lymphocytes ignore those antigens and say, yep, you're allowed to stay. But other antigens on like the surface of a cell of a pathogen or parts of a product of a pathogen, we'll talk about what I mean by that here shortly, or other foreign substances can be recognized by lymphocytes and then attacked to get basically to clear that infection before it gets worse and can cause problems. And these antigens stimulate the immune response because lymphocytes recognize these antigens and say, you're not supposed to be here, we need to attack you. So these 3 major categories of T cells, cytotoxic T cells, basically attack any foreign cell or a body cell that's infected by a virus. So viruses are attacked, and the immune response to viruses is basically carried out by cytotoxic T cells. So your own body's cells can be infected by a virus, and that virus can be recognized because the cells of your body can send signals to cytotoxic T cells to tell them to attack this cell and get rid of it. So basically a cell can say, look, I'm sick, get rid of me. And then the cytotoxic T cells take it from there. Helper T cells do just that. They help T cells and B cells do their job. So the two types of lymphocytes are T cells and B cells. And T cells and B cells are helped, they basically are helped to do their job by a helper T cell. Suppressor T cells basically inhibit the function of T and B cells. So just in case, or just so they don't get out of control. So T cells and B cells don't overdo it. You have suppressor T cells that basically can prevent them from being overactive. These B cells, so those are three types of T cells. B cells are really special in that they can differentiate, and by differentiate, think about what differentiation means, like a maturation. So these cells can mature or change. They can basically change their internal makeup into what's called a plasma cell. And basically that has to happen. So B cells are typically inactive, and they're not ready to do their job yet. B cells are the cells that differentiate into what's called a plasma cell that secretes antibodies. And they are responsible for antibody-mediated immunity. So basically what happens is B cells recognize an antigen, like T cells would recognize an antigen. And when they recognize the antigen, they change their internal makeup and become a plasma cell that can secrete a particular antibody that would attack that exact antigen. So B cells are inactive until they recognize an antigen, and then they can change their internal makeup and start to secrete an antibody that would attack specifically the antigen that one B cell once recognized. I think this is super cool. And while they're doing that, some of the B cells that differentiate, they divide and become memory B cells instead of plasma cells. And those memory B cells just basically stay in the body as a reserve, like military reserves, to fight an infection, that same infection, the next time it gets introduced to the body. So you don't have to mount an immune response the second time. You can just fight the infection before it causes any problems. Natural killer cells basically are responsible for immunological surveillance. So natural killer cells are always kind of floating around in circulation, just waiting for something bad to happen. And when that does, when something is foreign and they recognize it, they can then help mount an immune response with other lymphocytes. They attack any foreign cell, really. So they're just kind of surveying your body to make sure that it's always staying healthy. Any cells that are infected with a virus or cancerous cells in normal tissues that become abnormal can be attacked by a natural killer cell. And they're just constantly kind of monitoring peripheral tissues, like a security guard, basically. They're surveilling to make sure that everything's just A-okay. And there's just kind of an overview slide of classes of lymphocytes: T cells and the three types of T cells, and then B cells and natural killer cells. Lymphopoiesis. So we talked about erythropoiesis when it comes to the production of red blood cells back in the blood chapter. So erythropoiesis, a erythrocyte is a red blood cell. A lymphocyte is a white blood cell, right? A type of white blood cell. So lymphopoiesis is the production of lymphocytes, the process of the production of lymphocytes. And it involves a couple tissues: red bone marrow, the thymus, which is a gland in the lymphatic system, and peripheral lymphoid tissues that we'll talk about. Red bone marrow is basically the major site of normal lymphocyte production. We'll talk about that here briefly. But there's a set of lymphoid stem cells that can become any type of lymphocyte. So the stem cells that are lymphoid stem cells will become a T cell or a B cell. It just depends on some signals that they receive in the body. One group of the lymphoid stem cells leaves bone marrow and heads to the thymus, where there are thymic hormones we'll talk about here shortly that get produced and basically tell the lymphoid stem cell to become a T cell. The other group of lymphoid stem cells actually stays in red bone marrow and divides to produce B cells and natural killer cells. And those B cells then mature in lymph nodes, they mature to plasma cells in lymph nodes, spleen, and other lymphoid tissue. And natural killer cells just kind of migrate throughout the body patrolling. Remember, they're responsible for immunological surveillance. There's a slide that summarizes that. So this lymphoid tissue, basically connective tissue in the body, is dominated by lymphocytes. So lymphocytes can move into and out of connective tissue. Lymphoid nodules are basically just masses of aggregates of lymphoid tissue. And then actual lymphoid organs, like lymph nodes, the thymus and spleen, basically have a connective tissue capsule. So the only thing that separates a lymphoid nodule from a lymphoid organ is the presence of a capsule, a fibrous connective tissue capsule that would isolate that organ from the surrounding tissues. So lymphoid nodules aren't isolated from the surrounding tissues, and there's a good reason for that. So lymphoid nodules are clusters of lymphoid tissue, and they're found in tracts like the digestive tract, the urinary tract, the reproductive tract, the respiratory tract, basically in tracts that are open to the external environment. If a tract is open to the external environment, then that tract is open to possibly introducing infection to the body. So there's clusters of lymphoid tissues very kind of embedded in those tracts to make sure that if a pathogen gets introduced to the body, it doesn't get into the body further and cause infection. And these lymphoid tissues usually reside, they're located just deep to the epithelial lining that lines the passageways of those tracts. So like your windpipe, your trachea, your small and large intestine. Those are all passageways for air or food to make its way through those tracts. Well, there's those tracts, those tubes are lined by epithelial tissue. And just below that, just deep to that epithelial tissue, you'll find lymphoid nodules. It's basically a group called mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, or MALT. That's the epithelial tissue with some connective tissue just below it that basically anchors the epithelial tissue in place. If you remember back way from exam 1 unit, epithelial tissue is anchored to connective tissue below it by a basement membrane. Well, that connective tissue just deep to the epithelial tissue in these tracts, digestive tract, respiratory tract, for example, have lymphoid nodules. That connective tissue along with the epithelial tissue is called the mucosal layer. So it's mucosal associated lymphoid tissue. And one of those examples is tonsils. If you've had your tonsils removed, you are very familiar with them. There's 3 locations. If you've had your tonsils removed, typically you have the pharyngeal tonsils or adenoids removed. There's also, though, palatine tonsils and lingual tonsils. And when they get swollen, you can get tonsillitis. Usually if you have tonsillitis chronically, you'll end up having them removed. So take a look. Here are the adenoids. So there's pharyngeal tonsils. Those are usually what gets removed with regard to tonsillitis. There's also palatine tonsils. So this is your palate, and you follow the palate all the way back to where it ends. There's the palatine tonsil. And then the lingual tonsil. Lingual is tongue. So at the base of the tongue here, you've got the lingual tonsils. Lymph nodes function like a filter, and they purify lymph fluid before sending it to the venous circulation. So think about it. Lymph vessels have sections of them, little swollen sections called lymph nodes. And as the lymph vessels are carrying fluid back from the tissue to the veins, in lymph circulation, don't you want to filter that lymph before you send it back to the veins? Sure do. So basically what lymph nodes do is remove 99% of antigens, anything that's foreign, from lymph fluid before sending it back to the veins. So here's a lymph node. So basically from lymphatic vessels, you send lymph fluid into a lymph node. It gets filtered in the lymph node and then sent back out of the lymph node by what's called an efferent lymphatic vessel. So you've got afferent lymphatic vessels headed into a lymph node, and then efferent lymphatic vessels headed out of the lymph node. So once lymph has been filtered. In the thymus is a unique subset of tissue. It's a gland that produces hormones called thymosins. And it basically is where T cells, the one subset of lymphocytes that leaves the bone marrow and circulates to the thymus. This is where those lymphoid stem cells receive a signal. The signal is thymosins to mature into fully functioning T cells. And basically those fully functioning T cells get released from the thymus and then can go fight infection. The size and the ability of the thymus to secrete thymosins declines with age. And why that happens, we're not 100% sure. There's the thymus. So it kind of sits right on top of the important vessels that are headed into and out of the heart. The spleen is a really important organ in the lymphatic system, and it has several functions. It has some similar functions for blood that lymph nodes perform for lymph. So it's basically filtering blood like lymph nodes would filter lymph. It removes abnormal red blood cells by way of phagocytosis, so engulfing abnormal red blood cells that aren't doing their job or are just old and dying. And in doing that, the spleen can remove the iron from those red blood cells and store it until it's needed. And it can be sent back to the bone marrow where red blood cells are produced and recycled. So basically, any iron from abnormal red blood cells or old and dying red blood cells can be removed and then transported back to the red bone marrow from the spleen to be repackaged into new red blood cells. The body's really good at recycling things. Iron is one of those things. And basically, there's an area of the spleen where there's aggregates of lymphoid tissue that is a storage depot for B cells and T cells that can initiate the immune response from the spleen. So it has two functions, three big functions: removing abnormal red blood cells, removing the iron from them and recycling it or storing it until it needs recycled, and then initiating the immune response of lymphocytes. So there's your spleen, this big purple thing. And then over here is where it's located. So here's the right kidney. There's the stomach. So just behind the stomach and the pancreas, if you follow the pancreas to its tail, you run into the spleen. And that's it for this first section of the lymphatic system. I will see you in part 2.